Hello, and welcome to Encounters with Polish Literature, brought to you by the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. I'm David Goldfarb, and I'll be your host. In our last episode on Yuri Andruchowicz, I announced that in light of the recent Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are opening our platform on Encounters with Polish Literature to learn more about Ukrainian literature and the cultural connections between Ukraine and Poland. And we'll be adjusting our calendar to include some special episodes on Ukrainian Polish topics, featuring leading scholars and translators of Ukrainian literature into English. And today, we have our first living author on the program, or at least the first author speaking about her own original work, since we have had translators who have published original works, aside from the translations that they were discussing on the program. Before we meet today's guest, I'd like to thank everyone who has been following along with Encounters with Polish Literature. If you like what you hear on the program, click the thumbs up down below. Ring the bell to get notifications about new episodes. Follow the playlist of all of our episodes in the description of the program. Leave a comment if you can, and please click the subscribe button to show the Polish Cultural Institute New York that you are interested and would like to hear more about Polish literature, its past and present, here on Encounters with Polish Literature. Also, be sure to hang on and watch the credits at the end for some recommendations about where you can donate to support humanitarian aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war. Ukrainian-born Polish author, as she describes herself, Żanna Słoniowska's first novel, The House with a Stained Glass Window, was translated into English not too long ago by our friend and recent guest, Antonia Lloyd-Jones. She was born in Lviv in 1978 and won the Znak Literary Prize for that very novel in 2015 and the Conrad Prize for the Best Polish Literary Debut of 2016. The novel was shortlisted for the Nike Award, Poland's highest literary prize in 2016. The novel has now been translated into 5 languages: Ukrainian, English, Russian, French, and German, and the Spanish translation is on the way. In 2018, The House with the Stained Glass Window was shortlisted as the best foreign novel translated into English at Warwick University in the UK. And in 2019, Słoniowska was part of the Franschhoek Literary Festival in South Africa, which I hope we'll get to in our discussion. Her second novel, The Island, was published in Poland in 2019 by Znak Publishing House. And in 2020, she wrote a play called The Oscillations for the Wrocławski Teatr Współczesny, the contemporary theater in Wrocław. In 2021, she published a children's book, Discovering Ukraine, with Dwie Siostry, Two Sisters Publishing House in Poland, which is an outstanding European children's publisher. Her third novel is under contract with Znak, and I hope she'll tell us a bit about it. Welcome, Żanna. It's great to have you on the program.
Hello. It's nice to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
So I know that The House with the Stained Glass Window, which has been out in English now for a couple of years, is your first novel. And I think our readers or our viewers would be interested in knowing a little bit about, your path to becoming a writer. In the United States, we say that there's kind of an MFA industrial complex, that people go into a Master of Fine Arts program, they make contacts, they meet with editors, and that kind of gets them into workshops, and you kind of have to go through this route, but it's very different in most other countries, especially in Poland and Ukraine. So how did you become a writer?
So first of all, I was loving literature all my life, and I was reading. And I think that's the main reason. In my young years living in Ukraine, I was working as a journalist. And journalism, it's also the words, it's also writings. I was working for the TV, for the radio, for the newspapers, and I was writing somehow all the time. And then when I was 24 years old, I moved to Poland. But that's, I knew Polish language because I have Polish roots, but that's not only about that. I stopped working intensively because I was having I was having small kids. So my lifestyle has changed completely. And actually, I was missing very much. For one hand, I was missing very much writing. For the other hand, I was by that time I was feeling that journalism is quite a superficial thing in a way that I suddenly I had some ideas or some feelings, I don't know how to name it, them to express, and the journalism was not enough anymore. And this question of this immigration, that all was about that. I was from Lviv, from this magic city, and everyone in Poland has one's idea about it. And mostly people were considering me as a part of the pre-war, and now I mean the Second World War, the pre-war world. But I was young, and I was from this contemporary living city. And I was quite upset, telling them, Lviv didn't cease to exist after the World War II, because I can prove you because I was born there much later. So my first book was born out of this strong desire in a dialogue with a Polish society to confirm that my home city exists, and that I can. So my idea was to show them that it is different than they are thinking about it.
Yeah, just
their
briefly. Pre-war. Then their pre-war fantasy was of
yes, but at the same time, David, I understand what are the roots of the fantasies. First, it is a lost city. It used to belong to Poland for 600 years, and then it stopped to be Polish. This is one reason. And the second very important reason is how this legend was born, is that in socialistic Poland, it was forbidden to even to mention the city. That was a kind of taboo. So it was frozen somehow, this idea of Lviv. And I wanted to put more life in it.
How did it come about that your Polish family managed to stay in Lviv, since many Poles were relocated to the so-called recovered territories in western Poland, if I may ask?
It's very important to remember that some Poles stayed apart from this big movement. They had to accept the Soviet passports, and then they could stay. But this is not the case of my family, because my Polish family, the same as in this fiction book, it comes from the Lithuania now, which is Lithuania, and from later from the St. Petersburg. So both of my great grandmother and great grandfather both were Polish, who met in St. Petersburg. There was at the beginning of the 20th century, it was a really big community of the Poles there. There were, if I'm not mistaken, two Polish Roman Catholic churches where they met in this particular case. Yes. So then, but then it was a war, and that it was a Stalin repression, and the war, and somehow they moved to Lviv. It's a long story. Yeah,
I understand. So, and it's often the case that many writers, when they write a first novel, it's a very autobiographical novel. So, what parts of the novel come from your story?
Everyone always asks this question, but it's a complex process. Obviously, I started with my family, with my personal experiences because they were emotional, they were important. But at the same time, immediately after I start writing, I realized that it's not my personal story anymore. It was very obvious. So it was my family story was a starting point. But afterwards, I was changing the elements to put more of generational experience. I mean, the experience of my friends, my colleagues, the experience I knew from the history. And this is like this intellectual level. And the second level is, let's name it mysterious. That's every writer knows it. When you start writing fiction, somehow it corrects itself. You are writing the things you were not planning to do. That's the case also.
Another interesting thing that I think goes on in among Polish writers that we don't have in the United, or that's a little different from the way it works in the United States is the role of editors and workshops and things like that. And I know you attend workshops and things like that. How much did you show the manuscript around before you published it in Poland? Did you was it mainly a kind of a private process, or did you show it to editors, show it to other people before it made it to print? And did they really offer substantive changes or just corrections?
I was writing it very long, first I was thinking about it for about 2 years, and I was trying somehow to write some fragments. So it was completely private process. I haven't shown it to anyone. Then for another about 5 years, I don't remember exactly, but a long period of time when I was, having 2 small kids and being in this old new country of mine. I was writing, and I was not sure what am I writing, how to find a publisher, what to do, and which is more important, how to create this form of the novel, because it's a big thing. First, I was just having some fragments that were written, and I liked them, but how to put them together. So no idea, actually, no workshops, no help, no advices, no experienced writers, nothing like that. But it was not finished yet, but it was quite big already. And I started to send it to the publishers here in Poland, actually, and this is very true and honest what I'm saying. I was absolutely not hoping to have any foreign publishers, because that was a great surprise for me, but we can tell later. I was because I wrote this book in a dialogue with the Polish society, Polish language. That was very important for me. And yes, I started to send the manuscript to the different Polish publishers, and almost nobody answered. One guy, quite a well-known man, he told me, "Oh, it is interesting, please send me more." I sent him more, and then nothing happened. And but by the coincidence, if we believe in the coincidences, I met my future publisher just privately in someone's house. And I told her, "Oh, you are a publisher. Maybe you want to take a look." And the owner of this house, she was quite nervous, because all of her friends were showing to this particular publisher their graphomanic manuscripts, and they didn't want the publisher to be annoyed. But she she read it and she told me, yes, we are going to publish it, but you must finish it. And it was not easy idea, because as I said, it was not the entity, it was not the whole by that time. I still had to invent how to put it all together.
Who was your publisher?
So Znak, it was Agata Pieniążek.
Okay.
With whom still we work together. But then again, I was pregnant with another child, and I was busy, and another, I don't know for how long, several months or 1 year passed, and it stuck. But finally, yes, I managed.
Some people, I mean, I guess people think that, they'll, work in a different way when they have children, and often find they don't have any time. But that you've managed to, produce, 2 novels now, and and a play is impressive with children. Another thing I wonder is that I think, probably, our American or English speaking audience would be interested in right now is that, obviously, since the war broke out in Ukraine, people are becoming aware of all the complex issues having to do with national identity, multilingualism in this part of the world. They even realize it about themselves, that they say, they've always said, oh, my ancestors, they came from Russia, but then they realize, wait a minute, that's not Russia anymore. And maybe maybe it wasn't really Russia then, but it was part of the Russian Empire that had its own identity. And in your short bio you sent me, I was wondering, do you think of yourself as a Polish writer or Ukrainian writer? And you describe yourself as a Ukrainian-born Polish writer, and I think maybe that might be hard for some of our listeners to understand. I mean, we know that there are writers like Andrei Kurkov, who's a Ukrainian writer who writes in Russian, and we know about Alexeyeva, who's a Belarusian writer who writes in Russian, and of course all of the Yiddish writers who might be from what is today Poland or Ukraine or Lithuania or Latvia or Russia, who wrote in Yiddish. So what is it to be a Ukrainian-born Polish writer?
At one point, it was before all the colored revolutions and before 2014, I mean, when I was very young, I was asking myself the question of the identity. And it was a very difficult question by that time, because, we were all born in Soviet Union, where the national identity this question was distorted, and it didn't exist somehow. And we all were Soviet people, but some of us were Jewish. It was very complicated and strange. And I was trilingual from the very beginning, because obviously I lived in Ukraine, in this part of Ukraine where almost everybody spoke Ukrainian. So, I was in the Ukrainian kindergarten, for example, or on the streets. So I was speaking Ukrainian. But at my home, they were speaking Russian and Polish. Because I have some Russian and some Polish ancestors. And besides, the Russian language was the language of social life, like this in intellectual, social, this life of work, of the superior things by that time. And the Ukrainian language was a kind of daily life more language. It was suppressed. And yes, when I was a teenager and later, I was asking myself, what is the core of my identity? But I couldn't tell that I was Ukrainian, because it was a young state, and I was not sure I would identify myself with. So it was really complicated. But what I identified with, it was this a borderland of cultures and the languages. And that was for sure because, I was traveling and I went to Western European countries. I went to Moscow, I went to Poland, and I saw that everywhere where people speak only one language, it's kind of boring for me. That my homeland is the territory where people are changing the languages. They have different religious background. They are more open. That was my homeland. And but it was, later it was gradually, it has changed because with the first Orange Revolution, my friends and I, we were talking about this, how the Ukrainian identity is born now for us, for example. But that was a process, later process. So I was trying to, even after after I came to Poland, I was trying to, to have this several languages and to have this a kind of borderlands identity all the time. It was somehow precious for me. And in a way, I think this is an important part of being Ukrainian, this openness, this being inclusive for many, many, many things. What else? The funny thing is that the language. When I was a journalist, I was working with Russian, Ukrainian, and Polish languages. That was not a problem for me. But why I decided to write a novel in Polish, because my idea was that the things I describe won't be so interesting for my compatriots in Ukraine, especially in the Western Ukraine, because they know all of this. I'm writing for the Polish people to open their eyes about this, Lviv.
That's very interesting.
Yes, but afterwards, the first translation, it was the Ukrainian translation of this Polish text. Mm-hmm. And when it was ready, by the way, it is a very good translation, kind of transparent.
Who's the translator?
Marianna Kijanowska. She's a very well-known poet and a writer. So having this, Ukrainian, not original, but the translation of my book, I went to my home city as a foreign writer, as an invited foreign writer. And but people were considering me as a Ukrainian writer, because the book was about Ukraine and about their experience, and they completely didn't notice that there was a Polish original and a translation. So somehow this element was not important at all. And I was surprised. And then I understood, okay, I could be the Ukrainian writer as well. Mm-hmm. That's how I decided to include, all of that. So, and people very often, especially abroad, I mean, the Western countries, people are so mistaken of this complex situation that it's almost impossible to explain all of that. Am I an Ukrainian or Polish writer, and how it all works?
The way you explain the dialogue between you and your Polish audience is very interesting. Mm-hmm. That and they need that, right? I mean that the Polish audience needs that intermediary to be somebody who's a go-between, who's like a kind of translator of culture, which I think is really, really fascinating. So let's talk a little bit about the about the novel, The House with the Stained Glass Window. So it's the story of four generations of women living in one house, not unlike let's see, Jenny Erpenbeck, The Visitation has that kind of structure of, various women or living in the same house. Isabel Allende has a novel like that. How did you, what, maybe you can say a few words about, about how the novel is structured for our readers who haven't read it yet, and maybe say how you came upon that way of organizing the novel.
It was intuitively done. Some readers actually tell me that for them it is not easy to understand what was before and what was when. I think somehow it is a circle, that we are doing the circles, that we start with this Mariana's death, and in a way we also finish with this death, was the whole Lviv's history inside, not the whole, but the things I was interested in.
That's actually more illustrative than I think you think it is. Because it is like a novel of concentric circles. That it's occasionally you use this metaphor of the matryoshki, the nesting Russian dolls, of like one thing inside one story inside the other, and that's very much how I think an apt way of describing the novel. So maybe we let me give just for our audience a little summary of what's going on. So there are four women. There's the great grandmother. There's the grandmother who's called Abba. There's Mariana, who's a great opera singer, and then there's the narrator, who I don't think is ever named. Does the narrator get a name, or is the narrator just I? Yes,
just I.
The novel describes this kind of confluence of history, and it covers the time covered in the novels from about 1925 or so to the Euromaidan in 2013. I think that's the latest time described in the novel. The narrator is someone of your age, approximately, born in 1977, so maybe about a year older than you, and there's all four of these women aspire to be artists, but we only know that Mariana succeeds, and the I is still in formation. And they aspire alternately to be painters or singers, and then there's another layer of subplots of a romantic interest that crosses generations in curious ways. One thing that I thought was very evocative of the novel was the kinds of the ways that these patterns repeat themselves, that these love triangles happen between the grandmother and the mother, and then another one between the great grandmother and the grandmother, and then another one between Marianne and the narrator, and this repetition of the desire to be an artist, which may or may not be fulfilled. That seemed to be another interesting thing, just to orient people as to what's going on. So maybe do you have a favorite passage, something you might like to read, either in Polish or in English if you have it in front of you?
Yes, I'm ready to do that, and I decided to do it in Polish, if you don't mind.
Okay, why don't you do it in Polish, and then I'll read in English.
Drzwi. Każdego wieczoru prababka zamykała drzwi wejściowe według własnego wymyślnego rytuału. I jakby wierzyła, że mogą ochronić nas przed nieproszonymi gośćmi, tymi samymi, którzy odwiedzili dom w 37, na zawsze zabierając ze sobą jej męża. Sama do tamtej historii nie wracała. Natomiast Aba wspominała ją regularnie. Wieczorem zadzwonili do drzwi. Tatuś powiedział, że to pomyłka, że zaraz wróci. Pocałował mnie na pożegnanie i wyszedł z nieznajomymi. Już nigdy go nie zobaczyłam. To wydarzyło się w Leningradzie, gdzie Aba z prababką mieszkały przed wojną. Nic dziwnego, że we wczesnym wieku nabawiłam się lęków przed niespodziewanym dzwonkiem do drzwi. Otóż prababka zawsze najpierw sprawdzała, czy pierwsze, pomalowane na ciemno drzwi są mocno zatrzaśnięte. Następnie obracała klucz w ich zamku 2 razy, zawieszała spory metalowy łańcuch i przypieczętowywała innymi, białymi drzwiami, które też zamykała, tylko już innym kluczem. Tej konstrukcji nie dało się otworzyć z zewnątrz, co denerwowało mamę, która lubiła późno wracać i musiała albo stawiać na nogi cały dom, albo pozwolić, by prababka godzinami czatowała, czekając na jej powrót. Każda z nas miała własny zestaw kluczy. Długi i cienki śpiewał falsetem i otwierał ciemne drzwi. Krótki, z nietypową okrągłą końcówką, wzdychał basem i radził sobie z bramą na dole. Płaski, nowoczesny pasował do skrzynki pocztowej i najwyraźniej nie potrafił wydobyć z siebie żadnego dźwięku. Klucz od białych drzwi miała tylko prababka i nie wiadomo było, gdzie go chowa na co dzień. Te drzwi były moją straszną udręką. Zamknięte na wszystkie spusty potęgowały poczucie niepewności, jak wewnątrz oblężonej twierdzy. Zamknięte tylko na jeden zamek rozsiewały grozę i zdawały się narażać nas na wtargnięcie obcych, którzy mieli moc, by zniszczyć nasz świat. Pierwsze, ciemne drzwi były lekkie. Potrafiłam trzasnąć nimi z impetem, aby wyrazić codzienne, zrozumiałe emocje. Wkurzałam się na Abę, która kazała mi ubierać się cieplej przed wyjściem z domu. Ciemne drzwi zawierały w sobie oko. Okrągły wizjer zrobiony ze zwyczajnego szkła, zakryty od wewnątrz kawałkiem przetartej tektury. W tym prababka również upatrywała niebezpieczeństwa. Po pierwsze, gdy podnosiła się tekturowa kurtyna, człowiek po tamtej stronie zauważał, że jest obserwowany, czyli dowiadywał się, że w domu ktoś jest. A po drugie, jak uważała prababka, miał możliwość zaatakowania przez wizjer. Najpierw rób maleńką szparkę, by się upewnić, obcy czy swój, uczyła mnie. Obcy może wsunąć metalowy pręt, przebić szkło i zostaniesz bez oka. Obcy to zawsze był mężczyzna. Jeżeli ktoś dzwonił do nas przez domofon, należało wybiec na balkon, spojrzeć, kto stoi pod drzwiami kamienicy i jeżeli był to nieznajomy, krzyknąć: do kogo? Był to zabieg zastraszający. Stojący na dole nie od razu orientował się, skąd płynie głos, gubił się i z miną ślepca zaczynał szukać pytającego. Bycie o piętro wyżej dawało przewagę, dzięki której można było odeprzeć atak. Nikt taki tutaj nie mieszka. Pomyłki zdarzały się często i mocno niepokoiły Abę i prababkę. Załóżmy, że przychodził pan szukający jakiegoś Pawła Iwanowicza Pietrowa. Niby nic takiego, ale w ich głosach od razu pojawiało się napięcie. Długo zastanawiały się, kim może być przybysz i co to wszystko wróży. Rzecz jasna, nic dobrego.
This is the opening of the chapter called Doors. And maybe to set it up, just so we keep the characters all in line. So again, we're talking about the 4 women, and they're called Great Grandma in the English version. Abba, who is the grandmother. Mama is Marianne, the opera singer, and I, the narrator, the outermost narrator. So, Doors. Every evening, Great-Grandma locked the front door according to her own elaborate ritual, as if she believed she could protect us from uninvited guests, like the ones who had called at her home in 1937, taking her husband away with them forever. She never revisited that story, though Abba regularly reminded us of it. That evening, they rang the doorbell, Papa said it was a mistake and he'd be right back, kissed me goodbye, and left with the strangers. I never saw him again. It had happened in Leningrad, where Abba and great-grandma were living before the war. It's no surprise that at an early age, I developed fears of an unexpected ring at the door. And so great-grandma always checked first to make sure that the outside door, painted in a dark color, was securely slammed shut. And then she turned the key in the lock twice, hung up a solid metal chain, and sealed it with another white door, which she locked too, but with a different key. This arrangement couldn't be opened from the outside, which used to annoy Mama, who liked to come home late and either had to wake the whole entire household or have great-grandma stay up for hours waiting for her return. Each of us had our own set of keys. The long, thin one sang falsetto and opened the dark door. The short one, with an unusual rounded end, sighed in a bass tone and dealt with the downstairs gate. The flat, modern one fitted the letterbox and was plainly incapable of producing any sound at all. Only great-grandma had a key to the white door, and nobody knew where she kept it during the daytime. This door caused me dreadful anguish. Double locked, chained and bolted, it aggravated my sense of insecurity, as though I were inside a besieged fortress. And if only single locked, it scattered seeds of danger, seeming to expose us to the invasion of strangers with the power to destroy our world. The dark outer door was lightweight. I was capable of giving it a violent slam to express my daily, quite understandable emotions. I'd be furious with Abba when she told me to dress up warmer before leaving the house. The dark door had a Judas trap in it, a round peephole made of plain glass, covered on the inside with a small piece of threadbare fabric. Great-grandma perceived dangers in it as well. For one thing, as soon as the little curtain was raised, the person on the other side would notice that he was being watched, or would know that there was someone at home. And for another, as great-grandma saw it, he had the chance to attack through the peephole. First, just make a tiny chink to be sure if it's a strange man or one of ours, she taught me. A strange man might shove a metal rod through the glass and you'll end up losing an eye. The stranger was always male. If someone buzzed our intercom, we had to run out onto the balcony and look to see who was at the main front door. And if it was someone unfamiliar, we had to shout, "Who do you want?" It was an intimidation strategy. The person down the street didn't immediately realize where the voice was coming from, and in bewilderment, staring like a blind man, would start looking for the questioner. Being a floor higher up gave us an advantage, enabling us to repel the attack by saying, "No such person lives here." There were frequent mistakes, which caused Abba and great-grandma immense distress. Suppose a man came along looking for someone called Pavel Ivanovich Petrov. Nothing out of the ordinary, but you could hear the tension in their voices at once. They'd spend ages wondering who the stranger might be and what it all portended. Nothing good, of course. It's probably that moment in 1937 where the great-grandfather is arrested by the KGB and NKVD in 1937. Maybe?
Yes, it was NKVD by that time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Fill us in on what's happening there. How it's almost like this is like the originary trauma that causes all the other problems seem to stem to point back to this, I think.
I think it's not only this that episode, very painful episode of the losting father. It's at least my idea was to show something deeper. For example, when I say that the second door, it will be later in this fragment, that the second door is white. It is just a white color. It reminds the protagonist the snows of Siberia. And I think this is a very old idea of, let's say, Polish people who were put into Siberia in 19th century, and all of this idea of a huge, big northern empire, which is cold, and that somehow it eats our people, Polish and Ukrainians. And this is as I said, this is a generational trauma that is inside of almost of every Ukrainian. It used to be a part of the Polish identity, and it's not anymore, not in general, but in another configuration. And I observe that's now when this now we are in 2022, and I'm observing how this trauma works in the Ukrainians and in the Polish people, and there are differences. I think that Poles are much more secure compared to the Ukrainians in this issue. I mean, this inner security.
Yeah, and yet, I mean, one explanation of what we've seen in Poland, this huge outpouring of grassroots, support for Ukrainians who are fleeing the war comes from this perhaps exactly this recognition of this trauma that they know what it means when the Russian tanks come over the border, that this is not an unfamiliar situation.
No, not at all. But they are not so wounded inside. That was my idea.
Yeah.
And that's not only the case of being protected by the EU and the NATO. It's something much, much more deeper. I can explain this with one situation. Before Putin invaded Ukraine. Now, this new invasion, the full-scale invasion. During the 3 months, all of us were, afraid, would he invade, and blah, 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 all of those discussions. And I asked one of my Polish friends, why is she so relaxed? And she told me, Russia, it is far away from us. And I was like, what? Geographically, it is even more closer, but in her way of thinking, it was far away. And Ukrainian would not say it is far away from us. Never, at least now.
I'd like to go back to that interesting slip where you said where you were talking about your protagonist, and you said me. And that's like, as if you've ever taught literature, this is this thing that we're always trying to drill into the students' heads that, well, the protagonist is not the author. So when, this is just another character. But do you find yourself making that kind of slippage between, you identify with your protagonist, it seems.
Yes, for sure. But, it's a tricky question because now my memory is not so good. And sometimes I don't remember what was true and what I just made up, some details. With this example, I can tell you that that was a case with my great grandmother. She was really closing the door this way. So this is my true experience. That's why I said me. So for one hand, this is true because my great-grandmother was locking the door this way. With the slight differences I describe in the book. But at the same time, while writing, I was the writer. I invented this metaphor, this comparison, that the white door is about Siberia. As a child, I was not aware at all about that. So it is important to be aware that this is not a biography, because something is something absolutely new is created, is being created during this process of writing, and it includes many things that me as a one person was not thinking about. Like the whole community somehow through myself is taking part in creating this text, this many experiences.
Right. It's when something happens to you, of course, it doesn't carry symbolic value, right? I mean, that's the difference between, the chronicle of the diary of your everyday life, and then what happens when you make it into a narrative. That it does carry all these additional meanings. There are a number of references in the novel to the great Ukrainian opera singer who is not so well known anymore here, Solomia Krushelnitska, who seems to be kind of a model for Marianne, maybe for the grandmother, or who the grandmother might have become had she become an opera singer. She's more of the great grandmother's generation than Marianne's generation. How did you become interested in that story of Krushelnitska?
She's quite well known in Lviv. She was such a charismatic person. I had at home one biographical book about her, and also later her diaries. And this charismatic, how she devoted all of her life to music, how strong she must be, and actually she was on this world level because she saved this Puccini's opera, Madame Butterfly. She was singing really in the best opera houses everywhere, not only in Europe, but at the same time she was Ukrainian. And that was very important for her. And she was inspired by the Ukrainian music, Ukrainian folk songs. Actually, before I moved to Poland, I was not aware that also I was inspired with the Ukrainian folk music. It was always in the background somewhere. And that was so natural. And I never asked myself the questions about that. It's like the birds singing. And then I moved to Poland, and suddenly no one sings. My goodness, where am I? They don't sing. I mean, yes, they do sing in a concert hall or opera house, but the singing is not a part of their daily life. How do they cope with their emotional problems if they don't sing? Oh, they don't recite poetry. No, they recite poetry on a very snobbish small gatherings, but they don't recite poetry when they eat and drink and meet with the friends. And that's how it was working inside of me. Oh, I'm in a different country because before I was naive. I thought I know Poland. But that was naive because I was not living like deeply now. So we started with Solomia Krushelnitska, and we finished with myself.
That's all right, but I think probably like as an American, I mean, when I first went to Poland in the late 80s, I mean, the sense was that poetry was much more important to Poles than it was to Americans. I mean that, and it's not that poetry here is in the United States is a snobbish thing so much as it's kind of marginal. It's just something that it's a niche interest, that it's not. But in Poland, of course, everybody knew who the major poets were, and one thing that's interesting is here. I mean, just because of the success of post-war Polish poetry. I mean that people, I would say, to Americans who are interested in poetry, Wisława Szymborska is as widely read as any like great American poet. Because even in translation, her poetry speaks to a wide audience. It describes
yes, exactly. But what was the surprise for me? There's one nuance because the Polish poetry is much more intellectual. So you can translate it easily, and still it is the poetry. And I came from the background where the poetry was almost a song, so this special, it requires this special kind of reciting, almost theatrical, if you know what I mean. That this reciting poetry is sometimes more important than reading poetry. So it's a part of this daily rhythm, daily life, and that was not the case in Poland.
I can see that that it certainly serves a different role. Another interesting topic that or issue that struck me when I was reading the novel is that it's set in Lviv, obviously, and that before the war, Lviv is about a third Jewish, and it's kind of become by the time of the novel, it's a very much kind of buried identity. We see it in one scene where there's some signage that's underneath some plaster, and the plaster's peeling away, and there's some writing in Yiddish. I think I've seen that place in Lviv myself, or a place like that. Or there's a reminiscence of the 1918 pogrom that kind of against the Jews that came out of the Polish-Ukrainian conflict of that era, and I'm wondering how much today in Lviv, how much consciousness is there of Lviv as a Jewish city, as a city, a center of Jewish culture, which it isn't anymore, but it was at one time.
So again, during the Soviet time, it was forbidden to mention the Holocaust and to mention this pre-war Jewish population. So the subject was completely non-existent. At the same time, there were many Jewish people. I was raised with the Jewish kids, but they came from, after the World War II, their ancestors came from the other parts of Russia and Ukraine, and they were absolutely not connected with this old Lvivian tradition. But besides, after the Holocaust in Lviv, only 500 persons survived, and only 2 families, and most of them afterwards just went to the States or somewhere. So for me, the very interesting thing was to explore those 3 weeks of the Polish-Ukrainian fightings for Lviv in 1918, which is again not very well known, paradoxically, issue, because there is a Polish legend of Polskie Orlęta, and it's only a very narrow legend that doesn't show the whole complexity of the situation. And the situation is paradoxical because both nations were considering Lviv as their capital, of their symbol of the national identity. The same city, but 2 nations. And 1/3 of the population is Jewish. And my question was, what about them? What was their opinion? Because there are many of them, and the 2 nations are fighting, even don't asking them about what do they think. And I started to read all the books that left on this topic. It was very interesting, but still I was not sure were Jewish more pro-Ukrainian or were they more pro-Polish? How was it? And I must say that if I would write this book now, this chapter would look differently, because recently, about 2 years ago, Grzegorz Gauden wrote an awful book, like a marvelous book about awful things, about the pogrom, about those 3 weeks from the point of view of the Jewish population. And now we know that it was much, much worse than we could imagine what was happening.
A very important book, yes, I have it, and one that also deserves a translation. There are publishers who watch this program, so I'll just put that out there. That we'll put that in the bibliography on the website. So let me ask you about your second novel. I know that, like, for novelists, that's a big leap to go from the first kind of intimately personal novel to say, all right, now I'm a novelist. And I know when I heard a talk with Olga Tokarczuk, that recently, where she said, it took, she'd written several books before she felt that she could call herself a writer. And she started as a psychologist. So now you've published your second novel, Despa the Island. Maybe you can tell our listeners what it's about.
So my second novel, it's completely different compared to my first novel. This fact is very good for me as an artist, and it is very bad for my publishers. So after writing it, I realized that they were expecting the same book, the same second book, and the market also expects a kind of similar book. But I was interested in writing something completely new, and for me, it was refreshing. And this is if I can say like this is a chamber book. It's a book about the relationship. It's about the personal things. It's about the writings and love and traveling. And it's about 2 main protagonists. So no Ukraine, no revolution.
No, it is the stamp of history on it somewhere. I've only read the first 20 pages or so.
Nothing, David, nothing. Just it's a scandal.
It's about a character named David who lives on an island, so I know that I'll be interested.
Yes,
but and it does look like a very good book. I'm really looking forward to reading it. I sort of hoping that we'd have a couple extra days so I could read it before our discussion, but I'll read it.
So if there are publishers here, you can recommend, because it is still not translated into English.
Is there has a translator written a sample? Is Antonia looked at it? Or?
Yes. There is a sample. I have from kind of Antonia. Yes.
Okay. All right. So if there are publishers interested, then there's a sample available in a summary, I assume. Antonia is very meticulous about her summaries. She writes them in this very neutral tone. They're very uniform. So if you read the summaries of different novels, you can you get a good idea of what the work is about. And has it been well received in Poland? Is it? And are there any other translations in progress? Or
there is only an Ukrainian translation. The problem with the book was that the pandemic broke right after it was published, and actually there were only Zoom meetings, and somehow it was lost. But from time to time, there is a critic who writes to me, why this book was lost and blah blah blah. But my agent says that people will discover it after my third book or after, I don't know, the fifth book. So it maybe needs some time to be discovered.
And do you have a third book in progress? What's next?
It's very complicated with the third book because it's a good plan. It is half written, and now first I started to have the problems during the pandemics. Then I had some health issues, and recently, when the war broke out, I was completely shocked, and I'm not sure when I will be able to come back to the writings because this war is very personal. And even, during the first weeks, I was not able to read anything. So I have no idea what will happen with this next book. And the idea is interesting because it has Polish, Ukrainian, but also South African background. And it's about the treasure hunting in Ukraine, in the part of Ukraine which used to belong to Poland before the Second World War. And it's about also about not so known fact that some Poles after the Second World War were invited to go to the South Africa and live and work there because they were of aristocratic origin and they were not coming back to this, post-war Poland was not an issue for them. So they went to the South Africa, not far from Cape Town, and they were farmers. And they created a Polish community there, very interesting Polish community. And I met, I met those people, which is another interesting story. And so it's like many levels in this story that I can talk about.
It'd be interesting to know what happened to the Polish farmers in South Africa after the political changes in South Africa.
I think about one of my friends who was the son of those people from Ukraine, Polish aristocrats who moved in 1947, and he stayed. It is his country, and now he lives in South Africa. But I was there. I was invited to the festival, and I met many people. And yes, during recent 30 years, white people were coming back to, let's say, London or Amsterdam. They were leaving South Africa. I mean, people of the European origin and as well Polish origin. But this memories of this small community not far from Cape Town, with some Holocaust survivors, with some prominent people of the pre-war Poland, I think it is very interesting. And also this treasure hunting story, because some of them left their treasure in what is now Western Ukraine.
So before when they left, they buried their household goods. Yeah. Do you think you'll write something about the war? It's hard to write a novel during wartime, right? I mean,
I don't think it is possible to write literature about it right now, but I'm sure that literature will be created, the great literature about this. I'm happy to have many interviews, especially for the Western media. I'm really happy because it's a kind of mission that I can explain some things to the Westerners. So I have plenty of them.
Yes, I saw your op-ed for the New York Times. So that's that's about as well as you could do. So congratulations.
Yes, and also France, Germany. They are people there are interested, and that's valuable.
I want to thank you for being on the program. And I'm looking forward to reading Despa the Island and reading your next novel. So thanks for being on the program.
Thank you, David. It was a pleasure.
Hang on. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell to receive notifications about new videos from the Polish Cultural Institute, New York. Go to the Polish Cultural Institute's website, linked in the description below, to see a full schedule of upcoming episodes. Stay tuned for the credits for some recommendations about how you can support humanitarian aid for Ukraine and for Ukrainians fleeing the war in their country. I'd like to thank all the people who helped make this series possible. Our sponsor, the Polish Cultural Institute New York, is directed by Robert Czaniawski. Bartek Rymisko, head of Humanities and Literature at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, suggested this series and acts as our executive producer. My fellow producer, Natalia Iudin, handles all the video editing, technical, and aesthetic aspects of this production. Claudia Ofłona-Draber, head of communications at the Polish Cultural Institute New York, keeps us all informed about upcoming episodes of Encounters with Polish Literature and other events organized by the Polish Cultural Institute New York. Thank you all for listening and reading along with us. In the next episode, we'll be getting back to one of our previously scheduled topics, a Polish author who wrote in English and, as it happens, was born in Berdychiv, about 100 miles west of Kyiv in present-day Ukraine, Joseph Conrad. See you in a month.